Welcome to the Romeo and Juliet Act 1, Scene 1 and 2 analysis video. The opening scenes are filled with action, really designed to grab the audience's attention. Shakespeare provides all the necessary background information needed to really understand the world of the play. From the first scenes, we see all the different members of society, the different layers that exist. From the lowest in power, which would be the servants, who also hate one another from both families, to the prince, who is neutral in this conflict and occupies all the power in this society. Shakespeare also introduces us in the opening scenes to all the major characters and gives us some insight into their character traits. For example, Benvolio really comes across in the opening scenes as very thoughtful and yet fearful of the law, whereas Tybalt, we can see, is a really hot-headed and impulsive and just acts on impulse before thinking situations through. The audience also gets to see Romeo and his distraction by his initial love interest in the opening scenes, while also showing in that very powerful fight scene the deep and long-standing hatred between the two families, the Montagues and the Capulets. These opening two scenes really set the stage for the themes that Shakespeare is going to cover in this play. The play starts off with two servants from the Capulet family, Samson and Gregory, entering into the market and quickly spotting two of the other servants from the Montague clan. And right away, these two groups of servants that don't really have a reason to hate or be angry with one another, right away they enter into an insult match and they start flinging insults back and forth with one another. So we see that this feud, this long-standing feud between the Capulets and the Montagues, doesn't just involve the family members, but also their servants. On page 5, we have one of the most famous scenes from the play, which is often referred to as the thumb-biting incident, where you have Samson biting his thumb at the servant Abram. This gesture is both insulting and very symbolic. In the sense that it's insulting, it'd be the equivalent of giving somebody the middle finger in our day and age now. And symbolic in the sense that it's very childlike. It's a very childlike gesture to bite your thumb. And so what Shakespeare is trying to do in this incident is let the audience know that yes, there's a feud, yes, there's a big rivalry between these families and their servants, but that this rivalry is not really understandable or merited. It's actually quite childish, and they don't actually know why they're fighting. You can even see more evidence of the fact that they don't know they're fighting when Tybalt cries out on page 6, "I hate the word peace like I hate hell, all Montagues and you. Let's go at it, coward." He doesn't really say why he hates the Montagues. He just says he hates them all and categorizes them all in the same boat, if you will. But he doesn't know why. And so the thumb-biting incident kind of gives us a little bit of clue to the fact that it's very childish, this hatred. It's long-standing, and not a lot of people actually know why these two families hate one another. The video does an excellent job capturing the ruckus that this brawl causes. And on page 7, the prince arrives and says, "Enough's enough, stop this fight." And in the middle of his text, he issues a very important warning. I'd like you to find that warning, highlight that warning, because that will have a huge impact later on in the play. After the prince's warning, both families and their servants and everybody kind of disappear and go back to their normal routine. But Benvolio, Romeo's trusted friend, and Lord and Lady Montague stick around and have a discussion about Romeo. And the reader gets some clues as to Romeo's state of mind and some of the feelings he's been having lately. On page 8, we get a little bit of insight into what's going on with Romeo and why maybe he wasn't at this rumble. On page 9, Lord Montague gives the reader a bit of insight into Romeo's feelings about love and the situation that he's living right now. Take a close look at that passage. Look at some of the comparisons or some of the similes that Montague uses, comparing to Romeo to like a flower that won't open itself up. What impression do we get about the state of mind that Romeo finds himself in right now? Romeo enters the scene on the bottom of page 9, and right away the reader discovers that Romeo is lovesick, that something is troubling him, that it's not a light, joyful love, but it's kind of a burdensome love, and he's really torn and mixed. And on page 10, we see why this love isn't as joyous as it should be. It's because he loves somebody that doesn't love him back. And then through pages 10, 11, and 12, Romeo describes or gives his impression, this torn impressions of what he sees love is. Take a look at some of those passages. For instance, on page 10, Romeo has a scene where he says, love is heavy and light, bright and dark, hot and cold, sick and healthy, asleep and awake. It's everything except what it is. This is love, the love I feel, though no one loves me back. What did Romeo just do here when he described love? What do you notice about the characteristics that he gave to love in these words or these passages that I just read? The scene ends with Benvolio trying to give his friend some advice on page 12, kind of encouraging him Romeo to just forget about this woman that he's in love with, but that doesn't love him back. Scene 2 starts off with Paris and Lord Capulet having a discussion about the future possibility of Paris marrying Lord Capulet's daughter, Juliet. Now, you need to understand in this era, it was very common for arranged marriages to take place. In many ways, parents would negotiate this arranged marriage like a business deal. And sadly, they didn't always take into consideration their daughter's feelings, whether she would actually love this man, whether she was ready to get married, or even if she wanted to get married. Parents would simply decide. Now, what I want you to do is look at these passages, and I want you to take note of your impressions of Lord Capulet when it comes to marriage and his daughter. Pay specific attention to the bottom of page 13 when he talks about what he wants for his daughter. Notice that his daughter is still very young. It says that on page 13 that my daughter is still young. She's not even 14 years old yet. So you can see just how young she is, and you can also maybe see how Lord Capulet is maybe a little different than some of the typical fathers of this era. Not only do we learn that Lord Capulet is possibly a little different than the stereotypical fathers of this era, we also see that he likes to have a good time, likes to have parties, and is a very gracious host. And he sends out Peter, one of his servants, to invite guests to his house that night, and encourages Paris to come by and get to know his daughter a little bit more, but also to maybe meet other people that he might find interesting. On page 14, Shakespeare introduces the reader to a little bit of humor and irony. Now, you need to understand Romeo and Juliet is considered a tragic love story. Most of the play centers around love, some of the troubles of love, and also violence and tragedy. And so from time to time, Shakespeare tries to lighten the mood a little bit and adds these humorous scenes that often involve the lower class, the servants. the scene with Peter on page 14 is quite funny because Lord Capulet sends Peter out to deliver these invitations. And yet, in the middle of the text on page 14, Peter reveals a shocking truth when he says, "I can't read." So I want you to look at that passage very carefully because, yes, it's ironic that he gets sent out, and yes, it's funny, but it also introduces for the first time an element of fate. Now we see as the scene goes on that Peter, when he's out delivering these invitations, runs into Romeo and Benvolio. These two friends offer to help Peter, who's struggling with these invitations, and so to reward them for their kindness, Peter makes them an offer on page 16. So I want you to turn to page 16 and look at that invitation that Peter gives out to Romeo and Benvolio. And again, make note of what tool this is that Shakespeare decided to use in this instance. Now the scene ends with the two friends agreeing to go to this party, and then we have the scene ending with our first example of foreshadowing. Now you need to understand Shakespeare likes to prepare his audience, and so many of his plays, and Romeo and Juliet is no exception, is filled with foreshadowing. And so Romeo says something at the end of the scene that is definitely foreshadowing to what's to come. Now I want you to look at that passage carefully and make note, who is Romeo literally talking about when he says that phrase? And if it's foreshadowing, which it is, who is he eventually going to be talking about with that phrase? So make note of that. That's it for Act 1, Scenes 1 and 2. If ever you have any questions, please post them on Edmodo, and I will try to answer them and discuss it in class. Up next is Scene 3, where we finally get to meet Juliet and the important women of the Capulet clan.